Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Eliana Kernodle. With Election Day right around the corner, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris are in the home stretch of their campaigns. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, what are we hearing from the candidates at their most recent rallies?
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump kicked off this week with what is considered their quote-unquote closing arguments. For Kamala, that's a reference to her long career in litigation. However, the idea here is that in both of these speeches, they laid the foundation for why voters should ultimately trust them with the next 4 years of the country. And so the problem is, I guess, not the problem, but the notable difference here is that, sure, every election has its rhetoric that can be considered unhelpful, inflammatory, really going past the policy and hitting at the person's character. And I think 2020, 2016, 2024 have been extremely illustrative of that, because Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have taken to calling each other's campaigns hateful, full of divisive rhetoric. Democrats and Kamala Harris think that Trump and his supporters are fascists. Donald Trump says Kamala Harris and her supporters are communists. So really going for these buzzwords that can be really alarming to a lot of, middle of the road Americans who may be still torn on who to vote for. That's something that's really pronounced in this election. And so a lot of Donald Trump's speech at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach in Florida on Tuesday, he spent a lot of time reminding people that Harris has really progressive policies that are, out of alignment with, the American dream and traditional American values. He did spend a lot of the time in his press conference, which was very intimate compared to his gathering at Madison Square Garden, on Sunday, which has been compared to a Nazi rally, but we'll get into that. But in this setting, he centered mostly on victims of crime by undocumented migrants, specifically sexual assaults and murders. So the darkest of the dark and the most upsetting of the kind of crime that can be experienced. And so his point was that the Biden administration, so by extension, Vice President Harris, they've ignored or even exacerbated the conditions at the southern border, where they say people are flooding across in record numbers. And that includes criminals and people who are drug smugglers and on, terrorism watch lists, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the crime and violence in their home countries. So that's where he was in that press conference. Now, on the same day, later in the evening, Kamala Harris had a big closing argument speech in D.C., notably near the ellipses where Donald Trump held his rally on January 6, 2021, that Democrats characterize as an insurrection, as an attempt to overthrow the government because he was angry that he didn't win the election. So Kamala Harris really hit on that note, saying that Trump is just power hungry and he only cares about revenge and he doesn't care about what's good for the American people. She did mention some policy platforms, such as protecting reproductive rights through making it constitutionally protected again, and signing basically a bill that would enshrine abortion rights all across the country, in the wake of Roe v. Wade, which has turned it to a states' rights issue. She also said that she wants to enact a ban on price gouging. She wants to lower taxes for middle-class Americans. The policies were broad. There wasn't a lot of specific details about it. It's a lot of points that she's repeated in other speeches. So those were the compare and contrast, but really I think the rallies were mostly spent on demonizing their opponents.
And you mentioned the rally at Madison Square Gardens. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and kind of some of the things that were said in the wake of it?
That was an interesting rally from the perspective of the fact that Madison Square Garden is considered one of the most famous, if not the most famous venue in the world, and certainly in America. And it's in the heart of New York City, in which people would be hard-pressed to find a Republican voter. And so Trump sold out the arena, for lack of a better word. There were up to 100,000 supporters standing outside wanting to get in, but obviously it couldn't fit. And there he spent a lot of time hitting on his same points that he always does. In the wake of this, Democrats, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, President Biden even said that the rally was eerily similar to a Nazi rally that was held there back in the 1930s, and that Trump and his supporters are Nazis and fascists. This is rhetoric that, while is really hitting with their base, is backfiring among the voters that they still hope to court. There's a lot of political rallies and political events that have been hosted at Madison Square Garden, including a Democratic National Convention within the last 30 years. So a lot of critics are pointing out that other than the fact that Madison Square Garden has hosted many a political event, they're drawing the connection to Nazism is a reach, for lack of a better word. But again, it's something that has been lobbed against Trump for many years now. And given the events of January 6th and some of his rhetoric around that, and all of the continued insistence that the 2020 election was stolen, those kind of things don't help Trump when he's trying to back away from those claims or refute those claims of fascism. But again, the rhetoric is really symbolic and heated right now, not because it's necessarily the ultimate truth, but because the candidates are trying really hard to use that inflammatory rhetoric to get the last of the voters into their camps.
So how does this tie to Pennsylvania specifically as one of the biggest swing states?
Pennsylvania is arguably, it would be really hard for either candidate to win the White House without Pennsylvania. And so all eyes are on us and what we think as far as the candidates go. They've each visited the state more than a dozen times, Trump with a few more visits than Kamala, but he lost the state by 80,000-ish votes in 2020, and he carried the state by about 40-ish thousand votes in 2016. So there's a real potential here for him to get it back, especially because Kamala Harris is not polling as well as Biden and Hillary Clinton did in elections past. That being said, the rhetoric here in Pennsylvania, it's unclear how it's landing necessarily, except for the fact that people, especially the independent voters, according to recent polling, are most concerned about the economy and inflation issues. Immigration is something that matters, believe it or not, all the way up here, far from the southern border. Not as much as the economy and reproductive rights. Again, those are the three issues that are really rising to the top here. And so those are issues where feasibly, if you are Republican, you already agree with Trump about immigration. And if you are Democrat, you already agree with Kamala Harris about reproductive rights. So then it comes down to who do you trust on inflation and the economy? And so there's a lot of, that's where Kamala Harris really seems to struggle in Pennsylvania and beyond. And so it's unclear. I mean, it's going to go down to the wire in Pennsylvania. This is something that each candidate really has a good chance of winning here. How much this rhetoric will help or hurt, it remains to be seen. But it's nothing new to Pennsylvania voters. Again, that inflammatory rhetoric has been really on the upswing since 2016, since Trump entered the race. But it would appear that his cult following here has grown, that he's got a really strong base in Pennsylvania, that he's he's gaining ground in suburbs outside the big cities. He's gaining ground with unions, not public sector, but building trades unions. And his assassination attempt in Butler, I think, has really galvanized support behind him in a way that we have not seen before. So these are all very Pennsylvania specific voting blocks. And it's unclear. We even have reports that Amish voters who are traditionally uninvolved with politics, that they've been more interested in voting for Trump than in presidential elections past. So there's a lot of talk, locally and statewide, that there's momentum for him that isn't behind Harris in the way that one would expect for a Democratic candidate.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.